We're tremendously excited, in fact, to welcome Professor Christopher Breu, who is Professor of English at Illinois State University, author of several books and many articles, curator of a very lively Facebook group called Comparative Theory that some of you may know, and generally one of the sort of, vital people in our intellectual space at this point in the late 21st century. So we're sort of incredibly lucky to have him here. And what he's going to be presenting today is part of a work in progress, a book in progress called In Defense of Sex. And this is, I think, the second chapter?
This is the first body chapter.
First body chapter, okay. And the title of the paper is Gender's Ascent and the Decline of Sex. And I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming Professor Breu.
All right. Wonderful to see everybody. Thank you, both people online and folks here in person. And thank you, Ed, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to all of that, but I appreciate it very much. And thank you, Rowan. You've been very welcoming. The philosophy department's been very welcoming, and I want to thank the Women and Gender Studies program as well for helping support this talk. Just a couple things. One, this is taken from a longer chapter that I just drafted, and so one, it's new work. I'm open to to being told you really need to rethink a good third to half of that, or all of it. And then the other thing I want to say about it is that it actually is a longer historical chapter that I've basically excised the history from, ironically, because I couldn't fit it in the space of a talk. So it's really a set of points, but the history is really interesting, and I give it, not because, I don't mean like I make it interesting, it's interesting on its own, but the history is, I give a history of both the concept of gender and the concept of sex as they've both evolved over. Gender is actually a relatively recent coinage in terms of like how we think about embodiment. At least it only really took the form that we think about it now, as opposed to being about language or about kind. It only took the sort of dominant form we talk about now in the 1950s with John Money's work. And then sex has a much longer provenance, but they both have been relatively unstable categories. Although we tend to like to think of them as stable, they're actually rather unstable. And anyway, that's part of what the history I demonstrate. But that'll be in the background. But I'm happy to answer questions afterwards about that. But this is part of a larger project, as Ed was saying, and I won't belabor this too long because I know we all have things to do, and I don't want to go on too long. It's part of a larger project called In Defense of Sex. And at first I was going to make the argument for the importance of still theorizing in a non-binary way the sexed body. As somebody who was born intersex and had a number of unnecessary surgeries around that, I've had a very different perspective on thinking about embodiment and sex. And I've noticed that gender has come to replace sex in most contexts, including theoretical contexts. And I think that actually does a disservice to both terms when they're actually not thought through in relationship to each other. And I think we can have a concept of sex that actually complements the non-binary and increasingly complex and rich articulations of gender that are happening in the present. And so that's part of the argument I'm making. But as I started making this, people kept saying, "Aren't you going to talk about fucking too? I mean, it's called In Defense of Sex. So what about that?" And I was like, you know what? I mean, I'm not sure I can actually theorize the body without also theorizing sex. And I was also noticing that we're in a strange moment in terms of how we're thinking about sex in the present. It's both ubiquitous, but also seems to be ubiquitously a problem in various ways. And that's, oftentimes it actually is a problem, and I'm not trying to efface that at all. But it's an interesting moment. It's a very different moment than, say, the 90s were around, and even though it may seem to echo certain 80s discourses, I think it's a different moment than that too. So, so I want to talk about all of that. But unfortunately, I'm not doing that part in this. So, but I'm happy again to field questions for that as well. Okay. This is gender's ascendancy and the decline of sex. Gender's proliferation. Gender everywhere has replaced sex as a category. Mercurial, flexible, and multiple. Gender seems of a piece with the speed and viral logic of 21st century cultural life in the global north and in much of the global south. Meanwhile, sex, in contrast, is clunky, sadly binary, stubborn, and thoroughly unsexy. If the undoing of the sex-gender divide was central to the crucial work done by queer and trans theory in the 1990s, gender emerged as the victorious term of this dismantling. While deconstructions are not meant to have victorious terms, this is often what happens when the binaries are undone within the larger culture. Thus, when the line between masculine and feminine is undone, masculine often becomes the default norm all over again. Similarly, when the sex-gender divide was rightly deconstructed by queer and trans theorists like Judith Butler and Susan Stryker, gender emerged as a default category for sexual embodied difference in the academy, in official discourse and in everyday life. If anything, this tendency has grown stronger in the 21st century. Thus, gender becomes the preferred language to talk about trans identities, many queer identities, and sexual difference more generally. This preference is everywhere visible, from government forums and other official forums which use gender as a euphemism for an older binary conception of sex, to the proliferation of radically non-binary microgenders on sites like Tumblr and in popular culture more generally. On one level, the replacement of sex with gender makes sense. Sex, as traditionally conceptualized, is too binary a concept. Its binary emphasis on male and female functions to efface queer, trans, and intersex embodiments of all sorts. Moreover, it imposes a binary logic on all bodies, doing epistemological violence to the range of possible embodiments and situating even queer embodiments within a binary template. The logic of sex as a category is often seen to be heteronormative, transphobic, and perhaps also sexist. As Judith Butler has argued, sex is tied to an essentialist framework in which the binary of sex appears as essence, to which gender becomes the reflection. Quote, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. In this passage, Butler not only challenges the sex-gender distinction, but she finally jettisons sex in the name of gender. Sex cannot have any material force and distinction without becoming essentialist, a false limit on the possibilities of gender. Butler's insights in Gender Trouble and its sequel, Bodies That Matter, are foundational for any progressive account of gender. She is right to argue, in an insight that is crucial to later trans theorizing, that, quote, the presumption of a binary gender system implicitly retains the belief in a mimetic relationship of gender to sex, whereby gender mirrors sex or is otherwise restricted by it. The work she does to disentangle gender from sex enables contemporary understandings of gender as radically distinct from sex and or non-binary. Yet in disentangling the false mimesis between gender and sex, sex itself becomes indistinguishable from gender. What finally emerges here is a post-structuralist account of gender as discursively produced. The relationship of these discourses to the material body is eradicated, or at least effaced. While Butler goes on to theorize the relationship of discourse to the material body in Bodies That Matter, even here the body functions, as Stacy Alaimo and Susan Heckman put it, as, quote, a mere blank slate for cultural constructions. The body is material for Butler in Bodies That Matter, but it is an inert materiality with no force, agency, or limits. It is a surface for discursive inscription. A participant requests that live transcription be enabled for the meeting. Do you know how to do that? I'll hold on. Okay, I'll hit enable. I got it here. It just says enable. That should do it. Okay, cool. All right, that was easy enough. And I know I talk fast, so I understand that it would be helpful for all sorts of reasons to have a transcript. So yeah, totally. So, okay, this conception of the body as a blank slate is not unique to Butler. As Claire Colebrook argues, the framework has its roots in Foucault. Quote, Butler is vigilant in maintaining this Foucauldian critique of material and normalizing life. Foucault is a materialist. He regularly emphasizes the body. Yet this materialism gives the body no existence other than its shaping by discourse. Butler's position, as Alaimo and Heckman demonstrate, can be situated within the larger context of what they term the linguistic turn. The linguistic turn, which is also variously called the cultural turn or theoretical postmodernism, represents an anti-foundationalist theoretical approach that posits all aspects of life as primarily constructed by language and or culture. While structuralism and post-structuralism have a more complicated lineage, their focus on the structuring force of language systems, combined with the emphasis on cultural construction in cultural studies, feminism, and critical race theory, to mention only three, it combines with these to produce an anti-essentialist conception of society in which there is no pre-existing materiality or essence to the social that is not constructed by and only accessible to language. This framework did a lot of powerful work in denaturalizing cultural entities that were assumed to be natural, immutable, and foundational. As we have just discussed, within this framework, gender, like race, and a full range of other social categories, could no longer be seen as having a prediscursive meaning. Instead, the prediscursive was revealed to be a form of ideology produced by discourse itself. Yet along with the prediscursive, the non-discursive became equally effaced. It became almost impossible to posit any entity that exceeded or existed in tension with the workings of culture and language. Sex, the body, nature, and materiality itself were seen as fundamentally produced by the workings of discourse, or at least unable to be posited except through the workings of language, and thus finally reducible to the same. It is as if everything became avatar-like, with no attention to what might subtend, enable, or contradict such avatars. This emphasis on the social construction of gender and even sex has been salutary for much trans theorizing. Susan Stryker and Stephen White have situated the emergence of transgender theory within the context of postmodernism. Given the relentless ways that gender as a psychological and social binary was presented as predicated on an equally binary construction of sex, since such that masculinity was normatively attached to those whose sex was male and femininity with those whose sex was female, the destabilization of both categories and their necessary relationship was crucial for enabling trans and non-binary subjectivities to be theorized in a non-pathologizing and affirmative register. Similarly, Butler's deconstruction of the relationships between gender and sex, male and female, and masculine and feminine, also opened up the space for intersex embodiments to become more visible and less pathologized. Yet, even as Butler's argument had this effect, in its refusal to theorize matter and biology as agental, forceful, and delimiting, indeed as anything other than discursively constructed, it also threatened to render intersex invisible and untheorizable. For intersex is only secondarily about gender. It is primarily about the sex body and its refusal to correspond to binary understandings of sex. Similarly, while trans is a different dynamic, primarily about gender and gendered identification, accounts of it lose something fundamental, as C. Jacob Hale and Paul Preciado and Jay Prosser have differently argued, when the materiality of the body is thoroughly effaced. This dematerializing dynamic was not limited to work in gender and queer theory. The turn to gender and away from sex became central to the constructedness, plasticity, and performativity of phenomena more generally under postmodernism. While both theories of performance and social construction have been reductively figured in critiques of postmodernism, neither should be understood to be voluntarist or individualist. There are also reasons for why postmodernism, both as a body of theory and as a description of everyday life in the present, has fallen out of fashion. As work within what Alaimo and Heckman describe as the material turn has demonstrated, social construction as a concept excludes as much as it enables. Thus, things like the resistant, agental, and insistent materiality of the body, of the world ecology, of the built environment, and aspects of the world economic system itself tend to disappear. Indeed, everything conventionally contained under the categories of the natural, animal, or material is, if not completely negated, emptied of explanatory power and force. The material turn situates bodies, life, nature, and ecosystems within a materialist framework. This work is combined with recent materialist developments in Marxist theory, emphasizing the material production of social life as a whole, and eco-theory to produce an account of the human and non-human existence as predicated on material processes that simultaneously intersect with and exceed culture. Rather than nature being effaced in these theories, culture and nature are complexly intertwined, multiply determined, and alternately malleable and recalcitrant. Perfect, thank you. I was definitely feeling the need for water, so I'm gonna take a sip, hold on. And you got to catch a glimpse of me without the mask, so. My cover is blown. So, all right. Let's go back to this. All right. The material turn situates bodies, life, nature, and ecosystems within a materialist framework. This work has combined with recent materialist developments in Marxist theory, emphasizing the material production of social life as a whole, and eco-theory to produce an account of human and non-human existence as predicated on material processes that simultaneously intersect with and exceed culture. Rather than nature being effaced in these theories, culture and nature are complexly intertwined, multiply determined, and alternately malleable and recalcitrant. While it has been crucial for trans scholars and activists to challenge the binary logics of gender and complexify, if not fully sever, the relationship between sex and gender, this work has had the unintended effect of rendering sex itself as hopelessly binary and conceptually retrograde. I want to theorize sex with the same complexity and multiplicity that has been developed around gender in contemporary discourse. Similarly, while gender and sex can't be read off of each other or reduced to one being an effect of the other, the two can be neither fully severed nor subsumed into one another. If one of the things that this talk argues against is the reduction of sex to a rigid binary logic, one figured as the inverse of gender as a proliferation of individual identifications and expressions, one of the other things it argues against, and this logic works in productive tension with the first, is that we need to be careful not to proliferate. One of the things it argues for, actually, is that we need to be careful not to proliferate and individualize our objects of study so thoroughly that they stop functioning as sites of power, constraint, ideology, and collective world-making. Thus, while we can look at the categories in female and male and see, in fact, a spectrum of sexual embodiments that include intersex bodies and bodies with or without certain sex capacities or developments, we also do not want to erase the ways in which certain issues, like reproductive rights or the vulnerability to certain diseases, are statistically tied primarily to bodies that we still name male and female. It is crucial that we do not deconstruct sex and gender to such a degree that the ideological and material force of certain embodiments and identifications are effaced without being undone. I think we need to theorize the reason that as we fight and gain real traction in the present for a range of gender identifications and sexed embodiments in the United States, reproductive rights for women and trans men are being systematically dismantled. Womanhood and manhood are powerfully legible and embodied categories for most people, ones that shape life chances, actions, and possibility in large structural ways. Such an insight is even more important globally than it is nationally. Recognizing this does not negate the necessity of affirming gender identifications for trans and intersex folks, but it does suggest that the enemy of radical gender politics is not sex or the material body, but a specific reading of that body and its relationship to gender. As intersex and trans theorist Hill Malentino argues, intersex and trans need to be theorized together. Quote, there could be no resistance that would ameliorate the maltreatment of intersex individuals without coalition made with trans and queer folk, particularly those who have been deeply affected by the administrative violence that attends to the process of gender regulation. Gender regulation and the regulation of sex need to be thought together. Moreover, as Pigeon Pagonis and other intersex activists assert, given the overlap between the two, intersex and trans should be powerfully joined in struggle. In order to do so, however, we need to produce an account of sex as well as gender that can enable an adequate theorization of intersex as well as trans forms of identification and embodiment. Such a conception would recognize the ways in which intersex, trans, and genderqueer subjectivities exist within what Rebecca Sheldon terms somatocapitalism, or the dimensions of neoliberal capitalism that mines, exploits, and reshapes bodies. Such a conception would avoid what David Rubin describes as, quote, an intersex exceptionalism. It would also avoid a similar trans exceptionalism. Instead, trans and intersex, both as lived experiences and as categories of theoretical analysis, would be understood as functioning within and against the larger dynamics of sex, gender, and sexuality within somatocapitalism. Gender's limits. Gender understood as a constructed category might be suspect in our own new materialist moment, if only because it seems to participate in the same thoroughgoing logic of linguistic or cultural construction in which so much of postmodernism participated. There are other reasons to be suspicious of the proliferation of gender and the effacement of sex in our present moment. For example, the concept of gender as flexible, individualized, and open to self-expression echoes much of the logic of subjectification in contemporary neoliberalism. While Dan Irving has argued persuasively that transgendered rights claims often unconsciously rely on the self-entrepreneurial rhetoric of neoliberalism, I want to make a stronger claim here that contemporary ideas of gender echo neoliberal conceptions of subjectification as such. As Michel Foucault argues, subjectivity in neoliberalism is organized around the logic of human capital, in which a person is supposed to function as a self-entrepreneur through investing in themselves and tailoring their skills, affect, and personality to market demand. It is no longer the society that is the responsibility to train workers and provide for its citizens. It is the individual citizen who must shape themselves for the market or risk being left behind. The demand for the performance of human capital, the demand for the performance of human capital becomes ever more pressing as industrial jobs in the global north and certain parts of the global south are replaced by positions in affect, intellectual, communication, and service labor when they aren't being fully automated. Moreover, as David Harvey notes, flexibility as a logic is applied to both production as ways of keeping costs down by hiring and firing workers and moving production locations, and the workers themselves, holding down multiple jobs via the gig economy, retraining and educating oneself at will, maintaining one's health and competitive advantage, etc. The current conception of gender as plastic, individualized, performance-based, and often post-ideological echoes this logic all too well. By post-ideological, I am describing current conceptions of gender that proliferate the category so much that it stops functioning as a category of ideological socialization at all. A conception of gender as a locus of ideological socialization is precisely what was at stake in earlier feminist critiques of the category. While I don't want to re-binarize gender, I do want to interrogate what happens when it becomes so plural, so individually determined, so micropolitical, that it seems to elude the larger ideological structures and formations that organize society. On one level, maybe it has begun to outstrip the grip of ideology, and certainly I want to affirm the utopian currents at work in various redefinitions, appropriations, rearticulations of gender. On another level, though, as Louis Althusser has taught us, it is precisely when something seems outside of ideology that we need to interrogate its ideological coordinates. While I am focused primarily on popular discourses around gender, I want to interrogate theory too for its recurring language of performativity and malleability in thinking about gender, which echoes the definitions of sex and gender as plastic and thus open to endless surgical shaping, as Jules Gill Peterson and Ian Moreland have differently demonstrated. I recognize the genesis of the account of gender as performativity in speech act theory and performance studies, yet the metaphor also echoes in a striking way the emphasis on performance in the logic of neoliberal capitalism. Here, gender is not only a performative iteration, as Judith Butler has argued, but also potentially a maximization of human capital in the logic of neoliberalism. As one example of how this logic works, I would point to the way in which the most visible trans bodies are presented as hyper-glamorous and seamlessly transformable, Caitlyn Jenner being only the most obvious example. While on one level we want to affirm the powerful ability of trans bodies to signify as sexy and natural, this hyper-visibility also has costs. It is tied to the effective dimensions of the contemporary political economy. In such a political economy, hypervisibility situates the glamorous trans body as capitalizable and exploitable, particularly within the frameworks of entertainment and sex work. At the same time, many less glamorous and ordinary trans and intersex lives situated unequally in terms of race, class, and nationality, as well as gender and sexuality, become rendered, as Aaron Durbin argues, less visible. As this last comment suggests, the last thing I want to do is reduce gendered or transgendered subjectivity to an effect of neoliberalism. Quite the opposite. I want to disentangle the logic of gender and sex from neoliberalism in order to enable a gendered and transgendered politics that will be more fully resistant to the depredations and subjectifications of the current heteronormative and biopolitical capitalist order. Rethinking sex and gender. On the level of embodiment, I am arguing for a non-binary yet materialist account of the category of sex. In doing so, my argument complicates much recent work in queer theory, trans theory, and gender theory, which has tended to privilege the category of gender and efface the category of sex as hopelessly retrograde, essentialist, and binary. Gender is a crucial category. From a psychoanalytic vantage, gender is an identification that becomes an egoic mapping of the body. It is a version of what Freud describes as a body ego. Lacan calls the ideal ego as it functions in the imaginary, and Didier Anzieu defines as a skin ego. The body or skin ego is a conceptual and affective mapping of the body and a sense of self that often intersects with the material body, but is not reducible to it. The gendered body ego is not fully reducible to the surface of the body, but Anzieu is right to emphasize how much of our imaginary constructions of our ego, and of gender I would add, function as a skin, or what he defines as a bridge or screen mediating between the psyche and the body. In suggesting that gender is imaginary and structured around egoic identification, I am not trying to minimize it. Quite the opposite. It is central to the way in which we experience ourselves as a unified being, moving through the world and interacting with others, erotically or otherwise. If this is the account of gender I am operating with, the non-binary account of sex, my non-binary account of sex sees it primarily as a material substrate, aspects of the material body that are related to desire, sexuality, and reproduction. A non-binary understanding of sex is crucial to a materialist politics around embodiment, one that can help envision a better and more just embodied futures. I am arguing for a non-binary conception of the sex body that intertwines with, yet also importantly differs from, non-binary understandings of gender. Sex and gender in this model are profoundly interwoven, and yet they are not reducible to each other. Reducing sex to gender, as has been done in much recent theory, and even more in popular discourse, renders intersex illegible. It also erases specific histories of racial violence inscribed on what Hortense Spillers and C. Riley Snorton theorize as the flesh, or the dimensions of the body that were radically degendered, commodified, and violently inscribed during slavery and its apartheid aftermath in Jim Crow. Moreover, eliminating the concept of sex reduces the complexity of transgender and genderqueer subjectivities by effacing the materiality and specificity of the trans body as it intersects with gender identification. I draw upon materialist work by intersex scholars such as Hill Malentino and David Rubin, as well as recent genderqueer psychoanalytic and critical race and new materialist theory, to theorize anew the category of sex. Sex in this context refuses binaries. It is instead a dimension of the flesh in Spillers and Snorton's formations. While the specific racialized history of violence under and after slavery, including medical violence, which points to later and less thoroughly violent experimentation on intersex subjects, needs to be maintained. Snorton also argues, quote, Snorton also argues for, quote, flesh as a capacitating structure for alternative modes of being. The concept of embodied sex I am proposing works as just such a capacitating structure, as well as a potential site for both violence and sustenance. Sex in this framework refers to the morphology of the biological body as it relates to issues of sexual desire, reproduction, and what has been called, rather reductively, primary and secondary sex characteristics. While we tend to think about this morphology in binary terms, feminist biologist and critical theorist Anne Fausto Sterling makes an argument for a much more complex and capacious understanding of sex as a category, in which different aspects of the sex body, including genetics, hormones, gonads, organs, and genitals, can and regularly do produce or materialize a range of different sexed embodiments. Quote, a newborn is a multi-layered creature, the result of having a chromosomal sex, a fetal gonadal sex, fetal hormonal sex, a fetal internal reproductive sex, and an external genital sex. We tend to frame the work of all these bodily agents in relationship to the binary opposition male-female. Yet the reality produced is multiplicitous, generating different manifestations of sexed embodiment. As recent work in epigenetics has demonstrated, even something as seemingly binary as genetic expression is shaped by environmental factors and the complexity produced by the interaction of different genes. So, even if we want to grant a basic binary logic to genetics, what this code produces is a composite of many different binary logics interacting and mixing with the non-binary logic of environmental factors. Moreover, causality in the development of sex characteristics often works in relationship to feedback loops and chiastic exchanges between cause and effect. The development of a given morphology may be in part shaped by hormones, but this very morphology starts to inform the production of hormones. What emerges is material bodies that have certain tendencies, possibilities, and limits, but ones that only from a certain distance, and only if one is squinting or looking through ideological blinders, look largely binary in their formation. This, then, is the non-binary concept of sex that informs the book's larger arguments around the intersection of sex, gender, and sexuality in the present. In rethinking the relationship between sex and gender, trans and intersex, embodiment and identification, I aim to push contemporary popular progressive discourses around gender beyond neoliberal notions of flexibility, micro-identity, self-fashioning, and personal choice. I instead articulate a materialist framework where the specificity of intersex, trans, queer, and feminist struggles can be understood without giving in to the internecine and unproductive battles that sometimes play out between these different perspectives. Gender over sex. What emerges from the historical, and this is where this is after I do a long history of gender and sex, and I come back. So, what emerges from the historical accounts of sex and gender as concepts is the increasing emphasis on the latter and the attenuation of the former. Part of the promise of both science and the Enlightenment is the ability to transform the world, especially the natural world, into forms and entities that please, affirm, and aid human endeavor. While there is a utopian kernel at work here, and science and medicine contribute positively to contemporary life in myriad ways, I mean, just look at the vaccines, among other things, right? It is also crucial to recognize that the materials and entities we transform through science, whether petrochemical, geological, plant-based, or animal, including human animals, also exert force, resistance, and agency in the broadest sense, as feminist new materialism has taught us. Moreover, there are often unexpected consequences to such transformations, as the current climate emergency demonstrates. We need an account of both sex and gender that is not thoroughly plastic, manipulatable, customizable, and what C. Riley Snorton terms fungible. And it is crucial to remember here that such a conception of gender is shaped not only by neoliberal capitalism, but by a long history of specifically racial capitalism and the conversion of those of African descent into living commodities under slavery. Certainly, we want to affirm the way in which technologies enable effective and affirmative bodily transition for trans and gender queer folks who desire them, whether it is through surgeries or the use of hormone therapies. Similarly, the technologies of surrogacy carry utopian possibility and reality of divorcing birth from specific bodies and enabling a more collective and non-heteronormative relationship to childbirth, rearing, and care. I want to affirm the ways in which technology enables various kinds of human and non-human flourishing and more generally. I think we need to be neither accelerationist nor Luddite about technologies. I think instead a properly eco-Marxist and queer approach to technology would analyze both what it enables and what costs and through what forms of violence. We'd talk about what technology enables and by what costs and through what forms of violence. Paul B. Preciado's engagement with the material and embodied transformations produced by testosterone and the way in which he reveals some of the affirmatively erotic dimensions of transitioning has much to recommend it. Yet his account of the virtues of what he terms the this is a mouthful, the pharmacopornographical regime is that, yeah, it's quite the term. Regime is at once too sanguine as in optimistic and not sanguine enough as in bloody. It also doesn't detail the material costs on which the extraction and testing of such technologies took place. On the other hand, Silvia Federici's account of surrogacy and transitioning technologies as only a negative development of biocapitalism is too anti-enlightenment and negating of biomedical intervention. Even as we affirm the possibilities that technology poses for non-capitalist flourishing, as both Preciado and Federici, despite their profound differences, are right to emphasize the ways in which technology in the present is profoundly intertwined with biopolitical capitalism. If there is a promise to the ascent and plasticity of gender as it is currently conceived, it would finally have to be fully realized out of the dictates of the market and the kinds of neoliberal branding, inequalities, and flexibility that it promotes. It would also have to be seen as not the only or final word in relationship to questions of embodiment and difference. Sex, as an account of the sexual bodily remainder that exists in tension with gender conceived as plastic, is crucial for further theorization, although it is a category that is in danger of going extinct. Yet we need to attend to the materialist specificity of the category of sex without transcribing it into a heteronormative framework. The potential for queering sex has been obscured by gender and its productive queering. It is time we returned a queer conception of sex to the forefront of theorizing embodiment and desire. Psychoanalytic accounts of both sex and desire complicate any simple notion of sex as about opposites. In a similar way, theories of intersex embodiment radically complicate any conception of sex as binary. It is important that we neither reify sex into a fixed entity of positive science, nor that we theorize it away by pointing to the malleability of its various discursive meanings. Recognizing the partial constructiveness of sex as a category does not mean that we need to treat it as being as flexible as gender. It does not mean that the strong constructionism of postmodernism was right all along, and we should see sex, like gender, as a product of discourse, and as such, open to radical historical contingency and performative resignification. This is one road to take in approaching sex, but there is another one. It is the materialist road, which posits sex, like Flesch and Hortense Spiller's work, as that which exists in tension with human cultural scripts and refuses plasticity, encodes wounds, and exists where gendered ideologies come undone and racialized and medical ones become exacted. Like Hedwig's angry inch in the play and film of the same name, sex is what remains from the manipulations and transformations of biomedicalized gender. It also insists angrily for a reckoning. Thank you.
I'm here for whoever wants to be the first person. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead. You ask and then he asks.
Okay, so I don't know, but well, first of all, thanks for giving this talk. It was very interesting. So this question is going to be real big, and if you can't answer it, or if it's just poorly formed, but we have this idea we need an account of sex. But I guess my very simple question is, what is the account, in particular, such that it's an alternative to the sort of obvious, maybe kind of reactionary. Right. If you meet someone who says, well, sex is gamete size, that's it, you're done, they have something very quick and snappy. Right. And if we want to have something maybe a bit more progressive than that, we want to have an alternative that can, has some theoretical advantage over that. And Absolutely. So I guess the question is, what is the account?
Oh, sure. I thought I spelled it out, but maybe it was unclear by the time I got to it. But yeah, no, that's right. It's an account that actually sees that there's, and Anne Fausto Sterling has posited this, but that there's multiple determinants of sex, and that they work in gonadal sex, hormonal sex, genetic sex, the sex of genitals, and there's one other which I'm trying to remember. But that in fact, sex, it looks probably more like a continuum than we recognize. That it's not binary so much as it actually functions as a range, but that it also sets material limits. I mean, some of what my theorizing of this came out of like having a number of surgeries, 17 in all. Most of them. All of them unnecessary, but produced by the first unnecessary surgery, and then the other ones became necessary because of the complications of that. And so I noticed that my body was refusing its sculpting. It was refusing to be gendered in the way that my doctors wanted it to be gendered. And I was like, that whenever I read, and part of this was reading Butler, but just also existing in a culture where we're redefining gender in really rich ways and important ways and powerful ways. But how can we also think about sex in a way that doesn't just reproduce as binary? And I think if we actually recognize that sex is actually produced by a whole range of different material actors, that we can actually have an understanding of sex as not simply binarized. At the same time, like I said, partly because I'm a Marxist theorist as well as somebody who does gender and queer theory, part of what I'm also invested in is not reaching the point that you sometimes get in certain kinds of theoretical postmodernism, where everything becomes so deconstructed that you actually can't map larger forms of power. So to think about something like, I also want to be able to still talk about, like, when we're theorizing things like abortion rights or violence, or sexual violence or something like that, we need to talk about the category of woman. We need to be able to talk in binary terms. But I think we should understand that as a heuristic rather than as actually describing what sex is, which I think is actually something actually much more, that people occupy a whole range of different possible positions within that. They may be grouped more generally on two sides, but again, even there, people's bodies are really particular, and we don't think about that. Instead, we binarize sex in specific ways. Does that make sense?
I think that's a great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. So I'm glad I was able to actually maybe explain what wasn't clear in the talk.
I should have gotten it more, but I don't know.
No, it makes sense. Other question? Yeah, go ahead.
This is sort of not a fully formed question, but I'll just be, I might embarrass myself here, but first of all, thank you so much for your talk. Super interesting. The question that I am trying to formulate is about the material account of sex, and the part of your talk where you discuss gender as a site of activity for capital, and it's a site of opportunity for capital. So but on the materialist account, would a materialist account of sex be also a site for resistance against the kind of manipulations and machinations and opportunism of capital, and what would that look like? Like, I'm having trouble
Excellent question.
seeing that, and I'm really interested to know what
That's an excellent question. I don't think it necessarily is. I think it can also function, and maybe I need to dialecticize the way I'm theorizing sex more fully with this. I think actually Snorton's account of the sort of birth of gynecology out of violent experiments done on slave women's bodies actually demonstrates, and Snorton's account of which he gets from Spillers of the fungible, actually demonstrates that in fact sex can also be a site of accumulation and capitalist investment. I mean, especially, I tend to take the large version of capitalism that from the 16th century forward that enfolds slavery as part of it, as part of its history. It's not, it's not a feudal holdover. It's actually a part of the ways in which reproduction works. The reproduction of capitalism works by non-waged labor of various sorts and by forced labor of various sorts. And so I would actually argue that sex can absolutely be turned into something that can be manipulated by capitalism, but I also think it does hold a possibility of building a different kind of politics. I think it holds open, and so does the transformation of gender. I don't want to negate that. That's done a lot of really important work, but I think actually the final chapter of the book, as I'm conceptualizing it right now, is actually going to argue for one that also is supported by an active and generous state, because I actually think you can't, well, I'll get into this, but I argue for a bodily and sexual commons, that we need to think about what kinds of collective investment do we make in bodies, in sexuality, in material investments, in order to promote a flourishing relationship to embodiment and to a whole range of different identifications and so that would be the argument. A lot of it actually turns on things like healthcare. A lot of it turns on so like if we're gonna I think capitalism likes us to think about identities and not bodies on a certain level, and and I think it's important and identity is also a complicated term. I mean it's also done a lot of really important work, and I don't want to negate that history of that work. But I notice the ways in which identity stops being collective these days so much as it becomes individualized. And so I think one way of coming back to the collective is thinking about what do bodies need to flourish, and all sorts of different bodies, and what do subjectivities need to flourish, and how can we invest in that and build in that project, if that makes sense. So yeah. Is there a question on here? Oh wait, here we go. I don't even know who this is, but that's all right. Does this approach to sex potentially risk regression towards the pathologization of sex, which has historically been used to marginalize and other certain populations, particularly in conjunction with Foucault's argument that assigning structures and categories to understand operates as an extension of power and control. Extension of power and control. That's an excellent question, and thank you. And I wish I knew who that was, but thank you. Do we know who that is? Oh, Seth? Oh, excellent. Thank you, Seth. That's an excellent question. Of course, that could be the case. I mean, I actually think sex has been part of how power has been functioning for a long time now. So I don't think I don't think by actually producing a discourse around it that actually tries to think about the resistant dimensions of it and the complex dimensions of it necessarily opens it up to further exploitation or extensions of power and control. But that's actually part of where I actually find Foucault's vision as important as it is and as central as it is for my work, finally limiting in certain ways. That I don't think that all forms of knowledge actually necessarily impose power all the time. I think we also, as scholars, have a real, we need to also attend to knowledge as something that also can empower and provide, and that can be knowledge as description as much as it is proscription. And I know we tend to always do this kind of meta critique that we get out of Foucault, where all knowledge is guilty and implicated in extensions of power. But I actually think that there's a utopian dimension to knowledge too, and I'm not ready to let go of that. And so that's where I think, in talking about something, if that's really the case, then we should abandon scholarship as such. And so I think that's one of the questions. That's how I would respond to that, if that makes sense.
You talked about tailoring medical practice and stuff like that to a plurality of sexes. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of wondering, how could medical practice and maybe government policy evolve to reflect this plurality? Like, how would things change? Like, right now we have maybe 2 specialists, urologist and gynecologist. Would we have to have a wider range of them, or would certain specialists have to do multiple jobs?
Oh, that's a really good question. And you're asking me to actually have like real developed policy visions here. But but I think it's an excellent question. I mean, part of what I would recommend is basically choice and consent be the central operative category of how one, I believe in socialized medicine and medicine being available and free and a right to everybody. I mean, that's just the absurdities of the American medical system become more apparent all the time. But beyond that, I actually think that what happened, and Jules Gill Peterson really does a beautiful job of this, talking about it in the history of the transgender child, that even the surgeries now that are really affirmative and powerful for trans folk, most of those came out of a history of pathologizing intersex folk and trans folk, and actually doing work like the stuff that was done on me to perfect techniques in order to reproduce specific kinds of bodies. And so I think, the 5th chapter in the book, the penultimate chapter, is actually about about intersex and trans to a certain degree being the kind of like the forgotten history of accumulation by dispossession of bodies that actually now inform the present technology that enables transitioning, among other things. And I want to say that transitioning, again, should be enabled and affirmed, but what we need, you can't do much about the medical violence of the past, but what we can do is make sure that it doesn't continue. And part of that is actually that the person should be able to, it should be the person, the patient should be both informed about all the possibilities and the limits of various surgeries, and they should also be the person consenting to the surgery, not the parents. It shouldn't be done because doctors just recommend it. And we can even, I know for a lot of trans folk, people who, often they want transitioning younger than the age of consent. And I think that's fine, as long as they're the ones who are really centered in that decision making. Like, so if they want to, and I think it's also about knowing, what's reversible, what's not, what are the outcomes of this kind of, a vaginoplasty versus a phalloplasty, those kinds of things. But I think empowering the choosing subject at the center of this is really, and choose, I mean, again, that's empowering the subject who makes decisions is maybe a better way to put that. So, because I was also being critical of choice rhetorics in a certain way. So, does that help? Does that help explain what I'm articulating? I think that would be part of a bodily commons, that we have a right to flourish and to flourish in various embodiments and various identities or identifications, to use the language I'm using, and that actually should be part of understanding how medicine intersects with everyday life and human flourishing. So yeah, absolutely. Oh, is there another question? Let me see if there's another question on here.
So this is another probably not fully formed question yet, but I guess I was sort of wondering if you had a sort of a diagnosis of why people like Butler and other theorists, like what's sort of motivating the downplaying of the sex side. And then I was sort of trying to think through this, and I don't know Butler super well, but I was thinking probably part of the reason for that is you wanted sort of the sex part to be sort of stable, like either as a blank slate or as a binary for different people, so that then it sort of frees up
The gender,
all the gender stuff that sort of reveals itself more clearly and allows more flexibility. So I was just wondering if you see that as sort of why that move is happening. And then I guess the related question is, if we destabilize sex, does that make it more difficult to make those sorts of moves? Or maybe you're okay with that.
Well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of the second. I mean, both. It's all interesting, but that second question, I haven't thought about that. It might, I mean, it would create maybe the lines would even blur more between sex and gender eventually. But I think there's a danger of blurring them too quickly. Because it actually winds up erasing the materiality of embodiment on a certain level. But that's interesting, and that might be a utopian. As you can tell, I do a lot of dialectic. I think rather dialectically, and there's the bad synthesis, and then there's the moment where you can hold out for like the real sort of coming together of opposites in different ways, and that may be a version of that. But let me come back to your first question. I think actually, for Butler, especially people working out of the tradition of de Beauvoir, there was the idea the reality was that biology was used against women to basically mark to basically enforce inequality and to enforce strong sex limits around what was possible and what wasn't. And so and to the degree that they were fighting on the basis of around biology itself wasn't liberating for women. It was actually the thing that became constraining, and it was really important what Butler did to interrogate and undo the kind of essentialist assumptions that were operating in that. And so I think, for a long time, and Stacey Alaimo has written brilliantly about this, and she's more articulate about it than I am, but for a long time, nature was seen as the essentialist thing that you wanted to keep gender politics away from, because it actually very quickly, would suggest that, well, women have a specific nature, and therefore, you can justify social inequality based on that. But Alaimo argues very powerfully, I think, that what that meant was that there was a disconnection between understandings of embodiment and ecology as it shaped feminist politics and feminist and women's life chances and life histories, among other things. And so I think that move was necessary. I also think the move I'm hopefully proposing is also necessary, if that makes sense. But as a follow-up, but Butler was, and some of this is still a long argument with Butler on some level, right? But a loving long argument with Butler. She was so important. Reading Gender Trouble was so mind-blowing for me, particularly as somebody who never felt comfortable in these in sex categories or gendered categories fully, and yet I always felt like there was something missing, there was something wrong, and constructivism always bothered me because I was like, yeah, I know, my body refused its constructions in certain ways, and so I was just like, how do we move beyond that moment? How do we produce an account of materiality that's also not an account of essence, if that makes sense? Yeah. So
there's another question online. Yes. This is from Yaman Wang. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I understand your project is to mobilize historical materialism and feminist materialism to revitalize sex while deconstructing the binary of essentialism and post-structuralism. I wonder how phenomenology, as reinvented by Sarah Ahmed, might also offer an angle on rethinking sex.
Excellent question. Thank you, Yaman. And I always enjoy our interactions online, too. So thank you for coming to the talk. You guys are making me really happy. Yeah, I think phenomenology, especially Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, is absolutely really helpful in thinking about embodiment. And the next chapter I'm doing right now, and I've worked in psychoanalytic theory a long time, but the next, among other things, but I'm really trying to get my psychoanalytic chops up to speed and my phenomenological chops up to speed, because the next chapter that I'm working on is on what was I going to say? Sex is extimate. I'm using Lacan's idea of the extimate as a way of thinking about sex, that it's an intimate exteriority or an exterior intimacy in a certain way, that it's something that's we both experience it, but it's also something that is in tension with our egoic conceptions of self often. It's about the alienness of the body. I mean, it's both. We both have to subjectify our bodies and recognize them and affirm that they are our bodies, and that's part of what's so powerful about trans identifications having a way of subjectifying a body that otherwise might have felt alienating or negating. In fact, often did feel alienating or negating. So we need to subjectify, but I also think we need to recognize the alienness of our own bodies. I mean, I've had this as, again, somebody, who I was in children's hospitals a lot, and I would watch, kids on the floor with me, and they were some of them dying of diseases that they had no control over. I mean, I had a partner who I had ALS, and I watched her go through that. And there's a way in which we like to domesticate the body. I don't think we should have a mind-body split, not at all, right? But we should recognize that there's an intimate alienness to how our body works sometimes, and that we both need to subjectify that, but also recognize its difference, its otherness, if that makes sense. So thank you, Yaman. I hope that makes sense. And I actually think Merleau-Ponty is one of the great people for talking about how we both conceptually map the body, and also that consciousness is always in fact embedded in a material context. And Sarah Ahmed does a beautiful work with that too. I agree, absolutely. Queer Phenomenology is a great book. And at the same time, I think it's also important to theorize dimensions of the body that are like the real in Lacan. They exist in contradiction or tension even to our mappings. And so I want to think about both of those, if that makes sense on a certain level. So other questions?
So I love this, and I'm going to take a tiny bit of moderator's privilege.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just push you a little bit on
the defensive,
especially the kind of political part of this, because I think, you're sort of treating Foucault and the way in which he conceives of power as kind of always imposed.
Right.
And I wonder.
You're right. That's not
because
necessarily.
one of the things I thought about as you're describing this is, aren't you really talking about a kind of affirmative biopower at some point here, right? In both dimensions, right? The sort of disciplinary dimension, but also in the communal and collective dimension of a different kind of biopower that wouldn't be driven by capitalism. And I would argue that there are resources in Foucault for actually thinking those kind of resistant community formations and different sort of structures of power. But I wonder if biopower in its richness isn't actually part of the way towards where you're trying to go, and especially as a way of thinking about sex, right?
Yeah,
because it's deeply imbricated with sex in particular.
Yeah.
So I want to.
Oh, that's a great point, Ed, and a great question too. There's two concepts, one each that was central to my last two monographs. The first monograph was fantasy was really central, and the second monograph, biopolitics, was really central. And I'm like, neither of them have shown up yet in this work, and I'm like, they're right there. Why aren't they showing up? And I haven't figured that out yet. I think I'm trying to work with a slightly different paradigm than the biopolitical, which sometimes I find hard to theorize contradiction in relationship to biopolitics. So, but I agree. I think it is a question of biopolitics and biopower, and I think again that last sort of more utopian chapter is going to address that pretty full on. But yeah, I think biomedicalization and there's also the work of Adele Clark and et al. In that book. Biomedicalization that talks about the ways in which neoliberalism now intersects with medical practices in all kinds of ways, and I think all of that is but this is also a biopower that sex itself as a positive, as an affirmative embodiment can be understood as a resistant form of biopower. You're right. There was I flattened Foucault a little too much in how I talked about him. Yeah, so.
So last shot, or are we going to let him off the hook? We got a lot of Q&A. Sure you
it was great.
If there's literally nothing else, it's not the greatest question in the world.
Is there anybody else on here? Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I don't know if this is a great question, but it's all I got. I think maybe the one area where I kind of do disagree is that I'm, I guess, not as much of a robust anti-capitalist as probably you are, a lot of people in this room. And so maybe one argument you could make in this direction is, well, look, if you look at, say, countries that have a recent history of, central planning, Eastern Bloc and stuff like that, it seems like they tend to have more regressive attitudes towards gender and family and stuff like that.
I would agree with that.
And like, Poland, Hungary, places like that, where a lot of this, rolling back of LGBT rights seems to be happening.
Oh, yeah,
and
totally.
even Marx seems to talk about, and I'm no expert on Marx, but Marx seems to talk about the way in which capitalism has sort of destabilized the family.
Yeah,
and so,
Engels too.
Yeah, does that provide a problem for the idea that the struggle against sort of heteronormative ideas about gender and the struggle against capitalism are somehow intertwined? Is there a potential problem there?
Yeah, I don't think so. I actually think there's a lot of really good theorizing about how, in fact, producing economic equality actually enables gender equality in all kinds of ways, and sexual equality. Certainly, I mean, there are totalitarian. I don't want to get way off on this, but there are totalitarian versions of state planning, and then there are democratic versions of it, and those tend to work very well. I actually think there's a book that came out that I've only read a little bit of, and I want to that's I forget what it's called. I shouldn't even bring this up but it's basically arguing that it's basically sex is better after capitalism or out of capitalism, and I forget what it's called, but anyway, but the argument is really that. A lot of sexual violence happens because of inequality, because of some of it is obviously just ideological, but it's also produced by radically unequal working conditions, about really sort of damaging exploitative versions of sex work happen often because people are at extremes in extreme positions around inequality. In all those cases, I actually think, the Soviet Union had, a miserable history in a number of ways, but it actually had a really good history in terms of women being in the professions. I think I think capitalism actually helps keep gender inequality going. I think it actually is very invested in that, if that makes sense. I think it actually helps structure the workforce in precisely that way. Another part of this is I get into social reproduction theory a bit, where, in social reproduction theory is about the unwaged, I talked about this a bit in terms of race, but it's also about gender, the unwaged labor that actually helps the reproduction of wage labor in capitalism. So, yeah.
I'd like to ask everyone to, join me in thanking Professor Breu for a
thank you all
completely
so much.
fascinating talk and a wonderful Q&A, and for coming to visit us here. And I want to thank all of you for
coming.
For showing up, and this is the first time we've actually done one of these in a room with a live audience, and we had such a wonderfully enormous kind of virtual audience, which was also great. This is, I think, the most people we've ever had come to a theorizing talk in one form or another. So I'm really thrilled by this, and I'd like to thank all of you, online as well, and thank you, everyone.